Good morning. Welcome to Sunday Story Time, the online program where I read children's stories to adults who act like children on social media. And most of the time, not in a good way. Nope. Cheers. Okay. For those of you who are just joining us, I'm going to get you caught up really quick. We have been reading the trophy chapter book, Flat Stanley, by Jeff Brown, illustrated by Steve Bjorkman. And last week we finished chapter 3. We're going to be moving into chapter 4. But before I do that, I'm going to give you a quick recap of the first 3 chapters, really quick, because chapter 4 is really long. It's really long. So for those of you who don't need to pay attention to the recap, I suggest that you do some exercises to warm up your attention span muscles, because we don't want you pulling an attention span muscle today listening to something so long. Sorry, so in chapter 1, we found out some very, very interesting things. We found out that the main family in this story called Flat Stanley, their last name is Lamb Chop. Yeah. Well, what we found out was one day, Mr. and Mrs. Lamb Chop were having breakfast or whatever it was they were doing. They're sitting around minding their own business. All of a sudden, their younger son, Arthur, comes screaming into the room going, hey, come look. And instead of getting up and going, look, they just went, we use indoor voices in here, son, and hay is for horses. That's what they said to him. Instead of just, So anyway, they finally get off their duffs and they go into the bedroom, only to find out that their older son, Stanley, has been squished in the middle of the night by a gigantic bulletin board that Mr. Lamb Chop so thoughtfully got him for Christmas one year. A bulletin board for Christmas. Whoop-de-doo. So anyway, they found out that Stanley was squished flat, so they decided that they probably should go to a doctor. But first, they should have breakfast, because a squished boy's got to eat. So they go to the doctor. The doctor remarks, well, by golly, doctors just have to really marvel sometimes at the things we don't know. So there's chapter 1. They found out he was flat and they took him home. And chapter 2, we found out something else, that Stanley Lamb Chop, Flat Stanley, is the kind of little boy that carries around an extra pair of shoelaces in his pocket. Totally normal, right? So anyway, because we found that out because his mom, Mrs. Lamb Chop, as seen right here, dropped her ring down that what they call a shaft. But so Stanley tied the shoestring to his belt buckle, tied them together right there, and then she lowered him down in there. And while she was doing that, swinging him from side to side to find the ring, the cops came up and wondering what she was doing. They were staring at her, and then they called her a cuckoo, is what they did. They called her a cuckoo, and that's when we found out that Mrs. Lamb Chop is a feisty one. She's got an attitude on her, and I like her. So anyway, then we found out a little bit later in chapter 2, Mr. and Mrs. Lamb Chop are so tight with money that when their son Stanley, Flat Stanley, got invited to go out to California to visit with a friend, instead of just putting him on a bus or getting him on a train or an airplane, no, they got a big envelope and folded him up and mailed their son in an envelope because they could. And not only that, once they mailed him, when he had to come back, the people that he went out to see mailed him back. But they at least made their own envelope. So they were creative about it anyway. So then they mailed him back, and everybody was just totally blown away by the mail service and jet airplanes. Okay, now in chapter 3, Stanley, we found out, was just a little bit of a show-off. He did something nice for his brother Arthur because they went to the park and Arthur wanted to fly a kite, but they didn't have a kite. But Stanley says, hey, use me for a kite. And so he borrowed some string, and Arthur went him up in the air, and Stanley was flying all by himself because he's flat. Arthur wasn't doing crap. He was just down the ground holding a string, and he got bored, and some other kids came and asked him if he wanted to play and go have something to eat, and he says, yeah, I'll go play. And then Stanley, showing off, just completely being a show-off, got stuck in a tree, and then they had to get him out, but Stanley was just kind of pissy with Arthur all the rest of the next day and the rest of that day. So that's where we're at right now. Oh, also at the end of chapter 3, we found out, there's a picture of Flat Stanley being the show-off kite guy. There we go. But anyway, at the end of chapter 3, we also have some foreboding of problems ahead, perhaps, when Mrs. Lambchop tells Mr. Lambchop, "You don't realize what I go through with these boys. They're very difficult," to which Mr. Lambchop replies, "Kids are like that. Please, dear, be patient." I smell fireworks. How about you? So here we go, right into chapter 4, which is entitled The Museum Thieves. The Museum Thieves. Mr. and Mrs. O.J. Dart lived in the apartment above the Lambchops. Mr. Dart was an important man, the director of the famous Museum of Art downtown in the city. Stanley Lambchop, Flat Stanley, had noticed in the elevator that Mr. Dart, who was ordinarily a cheerful man, had become quite gloomy. But he had no idea what the reason was. And then at breakfast one morning, he heard Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop talking about Mr. Dart. "I see," said Mr. Lambchop, reading the paper over his coffee cup, "that still another painting has been stolen from the famous museum. It says here that Mr. O.J. Dart, the director, is at his wit's end." "Oh dear, are the police no help?" Mrs. Lambchop said, because she's got a bone to pick with the cops. They called her a cuckoo. "It seems not," said Mr. Lambchop. "Listen to what the chief of police told the newspaper. We suspect a gang of sneak thieves. These are the worst kind. They work by sneakery, which makes them very difficult to catch. However, my men and I will keep trying. Meanwhile, I hope people will buy tickets for the policeman's ball and not park their cars where signs say don't." The next morning, Stanley Lambchop heard Mr. Dart talking to his wife in the elevator. "These sneak thieves work at night," Mr. Dart said. "It's very hard for our guards to stay awake when they have been on duty all day, and the famous museum is so big we cannot guard every picture at the same time. I fear it is hopeless. Hopeless. Hopeless." Suddenly, as if an electric light bulb had lit up in the air above his head, giving out little shooting lines of excitement, Stanley Lambchop had an idea. He told it to Mr. Dart. "Stanley," Mr. Dart said, "if your mother will give her permission, I will put you and your plan to work this very night." Mrs. Lambchop gave her permission. "But you'll have to take a long nap this afternoon," she said. "I won't have you up till all hours unless you do." That evening, after a long nap, Stanley went with Mr. Dart to the famous museum. Mr. Dart took him into the main hall, where the biggest and most important paintings were hung. He pointed to a huge painting that showed a bearded man wearing a floppy velvet hat, playing a violin for a lady who lay on a couch. There was a half-man, half-horse person standing behind them. Here, just half-man, half-horse person, lady on the couch, violin, floppy hat. Half-horse person standing behind them, and 3 fat children with wings were flying around above. That, Mr. Dart explained, was the most expensive painting in the world. The most expensive painting in the world. There was an empty picture frame on the opposite wall. We shall hear more about that later on. Mr. Dart took Stanley into his office and said, "It is time for you to put on a disguise." "I already thought of that," Stanley Lambchop said, "and I brought one. My cowboy suit. It has a red bandana that I can tie over my face. Nobody will recognize me in a million years." "No," Mr. Dart said. "You will have to wear the disguise I have chosen." From a closet, he took a white dress with a blue sash, a pair of shiny little pointed shoes, a wide straw hat with a blue band that matched the sash, and a wig and a stick. Mr. Dart's a weirdo. The wig was made of blonde hair, long and done in ringlets. The stick was curved at the top, and it too had a blue ribbon on it. In this shepherdess disguise, Mr. Dart said, you will look like a painting that belongs in the main hall. We do not have cowboy pictures in the main hall. Stanley was so disgusted he could hardly speak. I will look like a girl. That's what I will look like, he said. I wish I'd never had my idea. But he was a good sport, so he put on the disguise. Back in the main hall, Mr. Dart helped Stanley climb up into the empty picture frame. Stanley was able to stay in place because Mr. Dart had cleverly put 4 small spikes in the wall, one for each hand and foot. The frame was a perfect fit. Against the wall, Stanley looked just like a picture. Except for one thing, Mr. Dart said. Shepherdesses are supposed to look happy. They smile at their sheep and at the sky. You look fierce, not happy, Stanley. He's tacked to the wall, dude. Stanley tried hard to get a faraway look in his eyes and even smile a little bit. Mr. Dart stood back a few feet and stared at him for a moment. Well, he said, it may not be art, but I know what I like. He went off to make sure that certain other parts of Stanley's plan were taken care of, and Stanley was left alone. It was very dark in the main hall. A little bit of moonlight came through the windows, and Stanley could just make out the world's most expensive painting on the opposite wall. He felt as though the bearded man with the violin and the lady on the couch and the half-horse person and the winged children were all waiting, as he was, for something to happen. Time passed, and he got tireder and tireder. Anyone would be tired this late at night, especially if he had to stand in a picture frame balancing on little spikes. Maybe they won't come, Stanley thought. Maybe the sneak thieves won't come at all. The moon went behind a cloud, and then the main hall was pitch dark. It seemed to get quieter, too, with the darkness. There was absolutely no sound at all. Stanley felt the hair on the back of his neck prickle between the golden curls of his wig. Creak. The creaking sound came from right out in the middle of the main hall, and even as he heard it, Stanley saw in the same place a tiny yellow glow of light. The creaking came again, and the glow got bigger. A trap door had opened in the floor, and 2 men came up through it into the hall. Look, there's a trap door. 2 men. Oh, this is scary. Stanley understood everything all at once. These must be the sneak thieves. They had a secret trapdoor entrance into the museum from outside. That was why they had never been caught. And now, tonight, they were back to steal the most expensive painting in the world. He held very still in his picture frame and listened to the sneak thieves. This is it, Max, said the first one. This is where we art robbers pull a sensational job whilst a civilized community sleeps. Right, Luther, said the other man. In this great city, there is no one to suspect us. Ha ha, thought Stanley Lambchop. That's what you think. The sneak thieves put down their lanterns and took the world's most expensive painting off the wall. What would we do to anyone who tried to capture us, Max? The first one asked. We would kill them. What else? His friend replied. Well, that was enough to frighten Stanley, and he was even more frightened when Luther came over and stared at him. This sheep girl, Luther said. I thought sheep girls were supposed to smile, Max. This one looks scared. Just in time, Stanley managed to get a faraway look in his eyes again and to smile, sort of. You're crazy, Luther, Max said. She is smiling, and what a pretty little thing she is, too. Now that made Stanley furious. He waited until the sneak thieves had turned back to the world's most expensive painting, and he shouted in his loudest, most terrifying voice, "Police! Police! Mr. Dart, the sneak thieves are here!" The sneak thieves looked at each other. "Max," said the first one very quietly, "I think I heard the sheep girl yell." "I think I did too," said Max in a quivery voice. "Oh boy, yelling pictures. We both need a rest." "You'll get a rest, all right," shouted Mr. Dart, rushing in with the chief of police and lots of guards and policemen behind them. "You'll get arrested, that's what. Ha ha ha." The sneak thieves were too mixed up by Mr. Dart's joke and too frightened by the policemen to put up a fight. Before they knew it, they had been handcuffed and led away to jail. The next morning, in the office of the chief of police, Stanley Lambchop got a medal. The day after that, his picture was in all the newspapers. That brings us to the end of Chapter 4. Next week, we'll be reading Chapter 5, Arthur's Good Idea. Well, what was wrong with the last idea? He caught the bad guys. But I have to tell you that Chapter 5 is the final chapter in Flat Stanley. So, if we're going to continue, I'm going to have to find another book to read. So, until then, till next Sunday, have a wonderful day. Be nice to people. Make the world a better place for everyone in it. One love, my brothers and sisters. Flat lives matter.